Okay, so Dirisha invited me, and I thought there were going to be a bunch of engineers in suits. So I dusted this one out, and then so next time tell me about the dress code. Okay, so you guys have been super quiet, and I don't like that. I'm going to challenge you, okay? All of you, I'm pretty sure in this room, all of you know that model. If they leaking integrate, you put a threshold, and that's a 5, right? And this one, people build theories about it. But it's a model, it's not a theory, right? We can argue with some colleagues about that, okay? And it's a model that has assumptions, right? We have a capacitor, and then a resistor, and the voltage is to just indicate that the cell is alive, okay? And I'm going to just ask you, as engineers, we'll try this for the first time, and you should do a biology introduction. It's about the capacitor, okay? And you know this. The ideal capacitor does not exist. It violates health science, okay? We use the ideal capacitor is not because it's good, it's because it doesn't exist. Okay, you can go to check Ampere's law and all the assumptions. The capacitor, that capacitor, we use it because it gives us an exponential when we solve it. And we don't have to use it and solve it. But even back then, Jacques Curie, Pierre Curie's brother, said, I never found an exponential in the charging of the capacitors that I measured for his PhD thesis. It was a power law. Oh, he measured the capacity of tissues. And he said, there's the constant phase element. I'm pretty sure you know what that is. Okay? You take it in your bioelectrical. Right? And then even later, all the dielectrics, they can follow and explain in their terms. All dielectrics. They follow a power law. So we can just ask a mathematical thing. If we have the ideal capacitor, that's the equation of the ideal capacitor. What is the mathematical object that when we solve this equation will give us a power law behavior and a constant phase? Okay? And if you just ask that, the answer is a fractional order derivative in the voltage. I don't know if you have seen it, some of you probably. The fractional derivative, instead of being the first derivative or the second derivative, it can be the 0.8 derivative. Okay? If you go to the definitions of these derivatives, they give you that it's a non-local operator all of a sudden. It has memory, that's the integral. And it has a memory kernel that decays in a power law, like a comet thread. Okay? And this has been known for centuries. What does it give you? Well, if you derive a sine wave, it gives you a constant phase. That's the solution of a fractional derivative of a sine wave. And it gives you a power law in the amplitude, in the gain. So that's pretty cool. Because then if this power law of the input, if the input follows a power law, then because of the fractional derivative, it backs so much. Then, if your encoder is performing a fractional derivative, right, and the power of the input matches the fractional derivative, the order of the fractional derivative, the output, the power spectrum of the output is going to be flat. That's quietening the noise, and you know that that's an indication of optimal coding. Just like that. And why is that important? Because most signals in the sensory world follow a power law, right? You have seen that from signals. All of you have seen it because you're a neuromorphic engineer. But if you do it for others, for anything, they follow a power law. But also what we create, that's music, right? Speech, naming of things, food recipes across history and cultures. They follow power law. Okay, so what are the computational advantages? I could switch gears, right? That's my engineering pitch, the capacitor performance. I could say, well, the fractional order systems emerge from complexity. Okay, and there's anomalous diffusion and all these very interesting things in reaction diffusion systems. Actually, anomalous diffusion of fractional order, that's how electrons go through semiconductors. So we can say, well, instead of having the leaky integrate amplifier, we can collapse the complexity of a neuron into a fractional order leaky integrate. What can we reproduce? Well, without changing the biophysics of the model, the resistance or the capacity, just changing the fractional order of the derivative, we can reproduce these experiments, this accommodation of the spike rate. We can show that we can replicate data that shows that cortical neurons are not leaky integrated. They're fractional differentiation. They have intrinsic memory. This is just injecting your square input. And if you change the duty cycle of the square input, the accommodation of the firing rate should be the same. It doesn't matter if the duty cycle is 500 milliseconds or 3 seconds, right? That's the definition of a time constant. Well, the time constant of a pyramidal cells changes depending on the duty cycle. That's a fact. We can reproduce that without changing anything. We're not tuning the parameters. Okay, can we jump? And just because I have 20 minutes, so I like to talk. Well, can we jump from the voltage? I just said that the fractional order is in voltage. What about the spiking? Does it translate? And then you just do, and I'm saying that because there's accumulating evidence, experimental evidence, that neurons, primary sensory neurons, that perform a fractional order. Their firing rate is proportional to a fractional derivative of their input. Okay? That's a list of experiments. And this is from my own lab, recorded from a Purkinje cell. Our preliminary data also shows that Purkinje cells, the primary neuron in the cerebellum, performs a fractional order derivative of the input. So that poses a lot of interesting questions in neuroscience that we're pursuing, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Our fractional leaky integrated amplifier model has a power law in the gain, right? That's the firing rate with respect to the period of the input signal, and a constant phase, just like that. This is a computer model. And then it does some noise whitening. The input is in blue. The power spectrum of the firing rate is in black. Of course, nothing is infinite, right? It's over a range, and that has to do with the firing rate of the system and all that stuff. Okay? I could spend an hour talking just about it, but can we build it? Okay? What is the challenge there? The challenge is to find, in the physical context of the leaky integrated amplifier, the capacity, the capacitor is the fractional order. It's a capacitor. Is there a capacitor that is like a fractional order? And that's a tough question. People have been trying to build them. Because there's another field, you're into control theory, there's fractional order control theory, and there's very interesting aspects going on there. But we said, no, we're going to scour the literature, and people are using supercapacitors to charge phones, to charge cars. I don't know. These things, these capacitors, can have farads. Okay, these are the smallest ones we got, 22 millifarads. They're gigantic. And we said, and then people have seen that when you charge them, they take a long time to charge, and they follow like a power law. And they seem to have fractional order properties. And we got that $1. Okay. And this, just believe me, this is the charging of the capacitor. It follows a power law. This shows that it's performing a fractional derivative. Okay, that's a physical thing. Why is that important? This is counting down, right? Too much time. Because, so I wanted to challenge about the capacity. But I want to challenge you about like paying too much attention to numbers. Everybody wants to do this, right? Because it was the first one described by Chua. Although then he said, well, it's generalized to all of them. Okay, it could be a resistor, a multiplier, and a many dot. Okay, and well, the material in 2007 and all that stuff. But it turns out that if you just go to the basics, again, you can go to your fundamental classical electromagnetism. The most efficient, energetically speaking, electric component is a capacitor. A resistor will always get hot, no matter what you do. Okay? There's a bunch of collisions of electrons on material. A capacitor is not. So, and you know, these are the definitions of a main capacitor. They're not that different. Is if the capacitor is changing as a function of the voltage, for example. Okay, this is definition. You can derive this thing, and you can derive this equation. This is very simple, and this then you can take your capacitor and charge it, and discharge it, right? Apply a solid voltage, and look at the current at the charge. Okay. The same fractional molar capacitor has the properties of a main capacitor. So now we have a main capacitor with fractional, and it has all the nice things that we like. Let's just build it. Too bad that cover. So that's the circuit from his book. We didn't change anything. We took the capacitor and put a stack of supercapacitors. It shouldn't work. The total capacitance that we put was like 5 millifarad. That circuit works with 0.1 microfarad. If you put a 5 millifarad with a classical electrolytic capacitor, it doesn't work. Because, and we can talk about that in physics, or from a physical point of view, is the capacitor is outside equilibrium. It's never fully charged. And it has to do with how these supercapacitors are made. They're fractal structures and very cool stuff. Okay? But you can buy me a beer or some tea, and I'll tell you about it. That's the circuit, $10. It reproduces all the properties, again, the data from the model, from experiments. We can reproduce the spike time acceleration. This is with constant input. Okay? You can think about it like, oh, even with constant input, the entropy of the firing rate is increasing. Okay? And we can reproduce again the time constant of accommodation of the firing rate as a function of the duty cycle. Changes with the changes the function of the duty cycle, and it corroborates the model for the theory and the experiments. Are we cool? It also does a fractional order differentiation. The firing rate performs a fractional order differentiation. We don't know too well how the fractional order of the voltage is being translated into spiking firing rate. We don't understand that from a theoretical point. Okay? Too well. I can imagine. I have an active imagination. And you can do also some input whitening. We can make it more complicated. Okay? We can have a Hodgkin and Huxley circuit. On the left is a computer model of the Hodgkin and Huxley fractional order system. We take the equations and we said, so where's the history of that? In the voltage, yeah, it could be, but there's evidence that the opening and closing of conductances is history. If you do an experiment, actually a cell, depolarize it, keep it there for 500 milliseconds or a second or more. The time constant of going back, you release it, the time constant to recover, that depends on the time you held it up. Either you fantasize about having 1,000 hidden Markov states, or you believe that there's some history-dependent problem. In biology, we will call it allosterics. Okay? Is that cool? So we said in the computer model, well, let's modify the potassium conductance. It was so many. What you see here in the circuit is this part. I'll see if I can do this. There, that's the potassium branch of the circuit. It's just like a transistor that is controlled with an RC circuit. Okay, and that's a slow part of the circuit. Okay. We modify that conductance, and that's what you see on the left on your right. That's a class just constant input current. The top is the classic circuit, matches the computational model. When we inject enough current, you can see it. We can inject current, more firing rates. At one point, it starts generating these things that we call complex spikes. We went back to our computer model, and we were able to replicate. These spikes, I said, I talked to my postdoc. This is probably saturation. Okay, we let the system run for hours, and it may never disappear, and they look random. So I told myself, well, if it is something like noise amplification or anything, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't happen in the computer mode. But I replicated that. So I said this system might be in criticality. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But instead, right? Give me a second, I'll tell you what they did. I called my colleague, Maurice Chakron at McGill. He had demonstrated before that the primary sensory neurons of the weakly electric fish perform a fractional differentiation of their inputs, modulated by a potassium channel. Isn't that cool? We haven't modified the model at all. We didn't tune the biophysical parameters again. So, hey, Maurice, can you use a neuropixel probe, put it in the fish, as the fish is alive and sensing the natural environment, and tell us what you see. This is from his previous work. This is the fractional differentiation in the fish, fractional differentiation in the Hodgkin and Huxley fractional model, interpointing in both. And then he had recorded for hours on these neurons that they burst. We calculated the frequency, the histogram of these bursts. How many normal spikes between bursts? Just as in our computer model, they follow a power, which is indicative of criticality. Okay, so that was the first kind of glimpse of like this circuit is helping us predict general properties, not specific properties. Okay? We're not modeling precisely the potassium channel. We're modeling the dynamics. Okay? I cannot believe it. I'm going to finish on time. So we said, well, if there's history dependent, where is it in the fire? Okay, there's hold on with this. If there's history dependence, then the effect of any sensory input to the neuron should last longer than the traditional time constant. right? That's what should be considered. That the time constants depend on the field. At the top, on A, what you see is that whenever we simulate a classic circuit, it's firing, we lower the input current, okay, for 30 seconds. And then we increase the firing rate again, and then a horizontal line means no change in firing rate. Okay? This is a way we neuroscientists like to plot things. In the second one on B, what you see is the same experiment, but in the circuit, the fractional circuit in criticality. And that's the control. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. That's the control, just before that. Because there's noise, that's when you see the dispersion plan. Right? But when we perform the stimulus, we see a decay in the firing rate that continues and continues for 10 minutes. Okay? That is something. So we asked Maurice, can we do an experiment like that? And you can. These animals sense the electric field, so he can send like a white burst of electric field noise, and that sends this mirror somehow into inhibition. That's what you see at the top. He did it. He recorded. These are the first neurons after the electric sensor. Neuroscience theory says all the primary sensory neurons should follow the stimulus. Rely. Okay? Here we're showing that that's not the case. That neuron, and we don't care that in our case, we decrease the firing rate. And in his case, the firing rate increased. It doesn't matter. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the temporal evolution of the dynamics. Right? He saw that because of technical issues, he could only record for 5 minutes. He repeated the stimulation, and again that happened. Eventually, that died out, showing that there's a tremendous amount of adaptability. This is not synaptic plasticity, nothing. This is intrinsic to the cell. And then he blocked the potassium channels involved in this, and the neuron returned to being like a normal history, independent neuron. Okay? So we use the circuit. We use the theory to develop a model, then to build a circuit, and then to predict actual behavior. So, and this is my beef with a lot of how we're trying to model the brain. There's this assumption, not only that the leaking integral fire is true, is that the entire complexity of the brain is housed exclusively in the wiring and the synaptic waves. Okay? That's an assumption. That's not necessarily true. What I'm saying is that complexity is in time and it's intrinsic to cells, to individual neurons. And they can have all these capabilities that we're trying to build these very complicated neural networks, right? To do the noise whitening and all that stuff. Okay? Let me see. Oh, so what I showed you with the noise whitening is that now with these fractional order systems, we can have optimal coding, all the cells, the signals that exist in nature. But also, I will argue, we have done it, that's part of what the grant, is to do optimal energy. Just from a theoretical point of view, capacitors are the optimal element. And this can be measured. This is not a metaphor, this is not inspiration. I have measured these things in diffusion, in different things. We have applied these ideas from molecules to the entire cell, and now we're trying to do networks. Okay, let me just wrap up. I have 25 seconds. This is part of like the brain initiative. Initially, I have crazy and a theory-based R1. I don't know how that happened, but now we have an F3 EFRI. So $3 million, and then it cost $10 to make the circuit. But anyway, and then I have a team of people that we're trying to develop fractional order capacitors, modulate them, and build networks, and people that actually understand computer science, not like me. Okay, and then we also maybe will apply it to the edge. I don't know. That'll be fun. So that's it. And